Welcome, everyone, to Collie Bristow's US UK podcast, what I like to think of as the star on top of the US UK Christmas tree. In this series, I talk to some of my absolute favourite Americans, and what with this being our Christmas special, I thought I might like to talk to my absolutist favouriteest American in the whole wide world, Leslie Grant, or, as I like to call her, my mother. Mum, thank you so much for coming on today. This is really wonderful and a bit weird. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on. You had to call me your favorite, didn't you?
No, well, I did, but it's true. It's nice when what I say and what I mean are the same thing. For those that do listen to this podcast series more broadly, I usually use the opportunity to talk to professionals in this space about estate planning and about tax and trying to break down some of the issues that arise in this space in a way that's hopefully digestible and informative and maybe even, dare I say, slightly fun. But yeah, that's not what we're doing today. I mostly wanted to just chat to my mum about being an American living in the UK, given that Americans living in the UK are this kind of elusive beast that people in my community often spend a lot of time talking about. Why not let's hear about what it's like to be an American straight from the horse's mouth? Now, as always, please do leave a review, particularly if you think this Christmas episode is incredibly exciting, incredibly trite. Actually, if it is trite, don't leave a review. It helps other people find the show, so thank you in advance for that. Now, Mother Dearest, it probably helps our listeners to understand who you actually are and why I thought it would be interesting for people to hear your circumstances. Because in my experience, when I'm talking to a lot of Americans living in the UK, I frequently find similarities between your fact pattern and lots of other people's fact patterns. And although you don't know it, your name comes up in conversation quite a lot for that reason. So for those people who have not had the pleasure of meeting you before, why don't you sort of explain to people who you are and how it is you came to the UK all those years ago?
I grew up in Chicago, and as part of my university degree, I studied at the London School of Economics. So that was my first time ever coming to the UK. But I met and married an Englishman. And then after that, we lived both in the US, UK, back and forth. But that's how I ended up in the UK. I also worked in the UK, so I had experience working in the US and working in the UK. But that's how I ended up.
And that is something that I think will resonate with a lot of people, because we talk to people quite a lot about, if you're an American, you come over here, the famous refrain is, you say you're only coming for 2 years, or you say you're only coming for 5 years. You promise me you're going to go back to the US after your short stint here for education or work or whatever. And then you happen to meet a nice English man and you decide to settle here. And that English man is called my father, and you're now here a certain number of decades later that I won't publicly disclose. I've never actually asked you this question, if you feel comfortable mentioning it. When you first came to study at the LSE, were you also in that position? Presumably you weren't thinking, I'm going there to sort of test out the waters. You were just here to study.
I was definitely not thinking of staying long term. The reason I ended up in London is that, as quite common in the United States, my language skills are useless because I have very little chance to practice conversation in another language, even if I was studying at school. So I wanted to study abroad, but I basically was limited to applying for part of my degree to study abroad in countries that speak English.
I mean,
So I,
I'm certainly very grateful for you studying in England, because I could have been born with an Australian accent by the sounds of it.
well, we did often wonder what it would be like if we ended up living more of our years in the United States than the UK. I wouldn't have the really, really weird accent I have now. And you would very definitely have a very different accent that you have now. I didn't expect to stay in the UK at all. In fact, my parents were probably pulling their hair out that I ended up staying.
Yes, we that topic of conversation is not unknown to us, where you'll get a slightly different impression from either the child in the UK or the parent in the US as to what they think are the likely periods of time that a child will stay in the UK. And one of the biggest turning points as to how long someone might stay in the UK is about children, because of course grandparents are an excellent repository for free babysitting, and it's not uncommon for children to want to be close to their parents when maybe grandchildren are born. And I don't need to tell you how many children you have, but for the purposes of other people listening, I have an older and younger brother, and my older brother was born in the UK. I was born in the US. My younger brother was born in the UK. Was that a feature of your discussions with Dad, your husband, about where you want to raise your kids? Presumably that must have been.
Yes, it did. I mean, when we first got married, the first thing we had to decide was which country we were going to live in, because we were going to need to choose. We chose the UK first, but as you were born in the US, we moved to the US, we moved back again. So a question I think that we had as a couple was, do we both feel the same about living in each other's country? And did we both agree that the first amount of money we would save would be saving money so that we could travel back to the other country of whichever one we weren't living in? We agreed that we would alternate Christmases, so which, we would share it between the grandparents, because there's no, Christmas morning in one grandparent's house and Christmas evening in the other. Not, I mean, Concord is aside. But yeah, and also I think about where they would go to school and what type of school they would go to, because I think some people will think, oh yeah, we'll be here just for a couple of years, so we'll put our kids in the American school, and then they think they're going to go back, but they end up staying a lot longer, and that I think is really complicated. And I think one of the reasons that I ended up with a weirder accent and you ended up with a really strong British accent is that from about secondary school, we decided we need to stay put because the school systems are really different from each other once you get high school onwards. And so I think, yeah, having kids was a complicating factor. And actually, the decisions about being an international couple, it was important to kind of look at that. But the thing is, often people end up staying longer somewhere than they think they're going to, and that messes around with some of the best plan.
Two immediate things spring to mind. One is, the older I get, I realize that, the decisions and the plans that you make when you are at a certain age are never exactly how your plans will turn out. So I guess you always sort of throw caution to the wind slightly there. But the other thing that you and Dad did that I thought was very useful is you were very keen to make sure that we were dual citizens from birth, which happens to a lot of our clients and people in this community. As an American giving birth to a child in the UK, that child is almost certainly going to be an American as well. But making sure that we had both passports right from an early age so that we had the freedom and the flexibility to travel while we were younger, but then also live and work in both countries if you wanted us to, was very useful. And that just gave us that kind of flexibility to find our own path and make our own way at a point at which in our lives where we certainly didn't know what we were doing. So how would you have known what we were doing?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely were not accidental Americans. You were American from birth, and your brothers as well. It was a really interesting experience getting passports from birth, because about 6 weeks old, you go to get your passport for your, American born abroad. You've got your funky British birth certificate. You take it round to one side of the American embassy. They give you this certificate of American born abroad. Then you go around to the other side of the embassy with all your other documents to get your American passport for your baby. And it's like, oh, right, how do we do the passport photo? So you go into this little booth and it's like, okay, that's not the first time they've done it before, but it's like, okay, it's almost like a puppet. You have to kind of stick your hand up the back of their sweater, hold them vertical when they have no control over their neck muscles or anything, and sort of get a picture of a baby. And that passport's going to last for the next 10 years. And then you get it renewed. And when you were 10, we went back to the American embassy, or we were in the United States and we went to the British consulate, and you get the passport renewed. And again, that lasts from 10 to 20. And so the picture doesn't last for very long.
I'm sure it's absolutely not unique to being an American, but it's something I've often thought about before, which is when you're fortunate enough to have a passport from a very young age, your first passport, as you say, when you're 9, is still the passport of you when you were a newborn. Equally, when you're 19, the passport is still you as a 10-year-old, which is also quite strange because you do a lot of growing up in that time period. And yeah, it's going to come as no shock to anyone on this call. What I thought I would look like at 19 or looked cool at the age of 20 is not what I looked like at the age of 29. So now being in my 30s, hopefully this is the first time I have a passport that looks the same when I'm 40 as when I was 30. I guess when I'm 40, I'll have a different opinion. But I have often thought that's quite, 10 years is a long time to wait when you're a child.
It's also a really early introduction into the challenges and missteps of being an international boy, because you'll hear your parents, we have to drag you up to the embassy. You have to physically present there. Do you have the right documents? And it's the same in the US when you're going to the British consulate. It's a great introduction to the future tax complexities, where you think you've got all the documents all lined up, and oh, you did something wrong.
Oh, but I tell you what, it's nothing compared to growing up with an American mother, getting to school or being about the age of 8, and then realizing that the way that you pronounced a particular word, notwithstanding that you have a very strong English accent, happens to be pronounced in the American way because your mother just happened to have said it more times to you growing up than when your father did. And the example I always give, that I think actually it might have been Dad that took the mickey out of me for, probably when I was a teenager, is when I described the 1970s prog rock band as Status Quo. And he just sort of creased himself with laughing at the idea that I was going to call status quo. And I blame that entirely on you, because you must have said the word status to me more than he did. And he took the mickey out of me for that. So, many perils of growing up with two parents from different countries. But, I guess it would have been even worse if you'd spoken different languages.
But if I came in as an American, I came into the UK as an adult already. And I got myself into a lot more trouble than you would have done by using status rather than status at school. I mean, taking the mickey, I had no idea what people were talking about. One of the real positives of coming to the UK is I learned a lot of British slang and British swear words. That was probably aided by going to football games as well. But yeah, there's a lot of language barrier. There's a really great book called Brit Think, Ameri Think. It's a bit dated now, but it makes a translation between America and the UK and also about their attitudes on a lot of things. I think there's a more British friendly one called Very British Problems, which is funny for people who've lived in the UK for a long time. But for Americans who first come over, Brit Think, Ameri Think, like I say, it's a bit dated, but it's really a good explanation and maybe save you from some of those differences in swear words, let's put it that way.
Yes. Anyone who's listening to this podcast who's either been a client of mine or a colleague or a referrer who sat through a meeting with me, meeting new clients from the US, will have heard me use the aphorism or the saying quite a lot of, what was it that attracted you to coming to the UK? Had you grown tired of cold beers and warm summers, and instead you want warm beers and cold summers? It's a different mindset. I'm interested to know from your perspective what you thought of when you came to the UK, or what your first impressions were as Chicago and the Chicagoland area is a relatively metropolitan area. And so it's not like you were coming from the middle of a rural part of the US, but you still weren't from, Manhattan or Los Angeles and, the most international of communities in the US. So how was that transition? I mean, you've made sort of wry remarks about it, but more fundamentally, how easy was it back in the 70s, 80s when you first started coming to the UK?
80s, yeah. I mean, it's obviously a lot different now than it was in the 80s, but I think it was amazing when I first got here. And then I think I have in common with other people. After about 6 weeks here, I think I hit the lows because you're lulled into sense because it's the same language and pretty similar kind of attitudes toward life that it's going to be a lot easier than it is. And at first it was all very exciting. But after that, I think it was difficult for all sorts of reasons. I mean, one thing was like eating and cooking. I mean, it's funny now, but I would look at a recipe and I'm like, I thought a rasher of bacon was like a really big quantity of bacon. I'd never heard of the word rasher before. Oh my goodness, this recipe is going to have a lot of bacon in it. And it took me about half an hour to get some food at the butcher's because I wanted ground beef and I wanted cilantro. And I didn't know what to ask for. And that's like, oh, that's just so frustrating. And also, once you're here and then you have to get registered, I went to the Aliens registration office in Lamb's Conduit Street. That part of it kind of wasn't pleasant. But my first impressions, run-down buildings, very cold, damp rather than dry, cold.
Yeah.
Poor food. I think the food in London is miles better than it was then. That was the 1980s. Bad teeth.
God, you must have really loved Dad.
and poorly dressed men. Men had a really...
To be fair, I've seen photos of Dad when he was at university in the 70s and 80s. And again, that might just be him. I don't know. But I do take your point.
The other thing that struck me coming from Chicago is that people talked about the class system. And for all the nice things about America, I really didn't know what they were talking about. The other thing I found really hard is that I couldn't pick out the accents. So someone with a really, really posh accent, I'm like, it's all a bit of a blur. And they're like, you can't hear that? She's really got a posh accent. Well, I mean, the things I love immediately were pubs. The kind of much lower level of consumerism
Hmm.
There was not so much like the things I have and stuff like that. I missed the emphasis on service. The
Mm.
service industry was much better in the United States, but the sports here were much better, much more varied. But it was kind of weird going to a football game where the fans were separated.
Yeah.
The 1980s was not a great period for
No,
football.
no.
But I was also intrigued by how much people identified with this tribal, what was going on, because they said, we won. I'm like, what are you you went on the pitch.
Yeah.
But
I've heard that before.
That was kind of strange.
Yeah.
Queuing was very good, but the constant apologizing. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. I'm like, why are you sorry?
Of course, bear in mind that Americans don't have queues at all. Americans have lines.
Yeah. And Americans also don't have pavements. They have sidewalks. That is one word I have never stopped using, because it's like, okay, go and play on the pavement. That's the road.
The middle of the road.
States. I'm like, yeah, go play on the road. No, it's sidewalk. And I still say data.
I've been quite evangelical about the fact that, it might sound slightly unpopular to say so. I think the Americans got it right sometimes in the way they say words and the way they spell words. You know what? Language should be easy and clear. And the way in which the British language has evolved over the last 1,000 years, it's not always easy and clear. So, you know what? If another country wants to come along and reboot it and try and make it a bit easier, I'm not going to stand in their way. So, you walk on the side of the road, it's called a sidewalk. I get it. The one thing you haven't mentioned, and this will be something that's very universal to people coming to the UK, is, of course, that your family were thousands of miles away. And this is in a pre-mobile phone, pre-internet era. So contacting your family and having telephone calls and regular sort of time with your family must have been quite difficult.
It was very difficult. No internet, no mobile phones, no WhatsApp, no nothing like that.
No podcast Zoom recordings?
No podcast Zoom recordings. So we would write letters and we would use airmail paper, which was like onion skin. It was really, really thin.
Yeah.
And it was blue. And you would be careful about what you're writing, because there's no, delete, edit, like you would change paragraphs around on a laptop. And phone calls in those days were really expensive. There was a very famous telephone booth in Euston Station that was very near the residence hall that I lived in with obviously a lot of other students, international students. And the word went around that this telephone box was broken, and you could put a coin in it and it never ran out. So, because of the time, getting used to the time difference, you might call your family. It might be evening on a Sunday, but it was their kind of afternoon. And there'd be nobody else around Euston Station on a Sunday evening. And there'd be a bank of about 10 phone booths. And there's this really long queue behind this one phone. And people would come up and they're like, oh, are you waiting for a phone? No, I'm fine. I'll just wait for this one.
Yeah.
Because, money was tight and it was very difficult. And I suppose it was a different era where my parents would have just assumed no news is good news. So if they haven't heard from me, I'm still alive and I'm still, whatever.
Yeah.
And that being said, with your dad, I did go backpacking and hitchhiking around Europe. And I didn't tell them that I'd done that after I finished.
Yes, I can see why you might have waited until after to tell them that.
I was due to go home at Christmas that first term, and there was a huge snowstorm. And your dad and I were up north, and we were driving back down, and the snowed overnight.
Hang on, wait, the snowstorm was in the UK, not the US?
In the UK, just before Christmas. And we got up in the morning. We were staying at his auntie's house. We got up in the morning, and I'm like, well, what's the problem? We just dig the car out. Okay, I accept there's a lot of snow around the car. Dig the car out, and we're going to be on our way to Heathrow. That's
what a proud Midwestern would do.
Did I not realize that there's no such thing as snow plows?
No.
We didn't make it all the way back. And I just remember finding a phone box and speaking to my dad to say that I wasn't going to make the plane and we would have to make some new arrangements. And he just blurted out, where the hell is Peterborough?
Yeah, that's true. I just, I definitely remember growing up and going to visit your parents in the US around Christmas time and just being met with this wave of kind of euphoric excitement at having 2 feet of snow on the ground that would kind of come up to your sort of, come up to your belly button or something. And you go, I was about to say you go sledding. Of course, this is a UK podcast, so you go sledging. And just this kind of magical experience of being in the US. And then and everyone just gets on with it. And you come to the UK, and then it's main news item. 3 inches of snow has fallen in London and everything is shut down. And so I definitely have picked up that kind of slight passive aggression towards the British and their treatment of snow, I think, from you.
On the other hand, Brits are very, very tolerant of rain, all sorts of types of rain. I did carry an umbrella around in my briefcase or my bag in America for about a year when we were living there one time, thinking, why do I've got this umbrella with me every day? Well, because it could rain any day in America. And your cousins who live in California, they played football like you did when you were little. And I remember you boys rolling about laughing when they said, because California doesn't usually rain between April and October, when their football game was called off because it rained in June. And you just thought, we would never play football.
I distinctly remember playing a game of football at about the age of 13. And bless you or Dad were probably standing on the sidelines. And I couldn't see the other end of the pitch because it was raining so hard. So we might stop for a frozen pitch or we might stop for other reasons. But I think if you stop because it's raining, we'd never get any sport.
You'd never play. Yeah.
That's kind of your personal experience of being in the UK. And of course, I imagine is probably quite universal to lots of people. This being a tax and estate planning podcast, the one thing that we have not yet touched on is tax. And you are probably singularly the greatest person to blame for why I do the job that I do and why this podcast exists. So ultimately, it's your fault. You are the person who taught me from a young age. And, I was fortunate enough that you knew enough to teach me about the consequences of being an American living in the UK and the obligations that put on you. As I've joked to many people over the years in my job, being an American citizen is like being a member of a not that exclusive club, but you got to pay your membership fees, whether you use the club or not. What was your experience? Do you remember what it was like now suddenly being abroad and feeling like, wait, I've still got to pay my US taxes and file my tax return and file my UK return? This is just an absolute nightmare.
Oh, well, if learning to drive on the left, so I'm able to drive on the left and the right, could have been the example. I wish I could learn to drive HMRC and the IRS at the same time. Driving on the left and right is a lot easier than navigating HMRC and the IRS. Yeah, it's complicated. And it's infuriating on both sides because the tax years don't overlap, because the authorities don't see things the same way. And so you have to speak a dual language of HMRC and IRS, just like you have to drive on the left and you have to drive on the right. You have to keep swapping. But I think I made a lot of good choices, but I also made some classic mistakes. One of the mistakes I think I made was thinking that I understood how the two systems work. And I got a lot of help with my tax in the early part of my career when you were a young boy, because I was an international person. So my employer was paying for my tax returns in both countries. But when I started doing it for myself, I thought, heck, this is really expensive. I got the hang of this. I've got my old tax returns from the US. I've got my old tax returns from the UK. I can do this. I'm a smart person. I mean, one of the really good things is the UK tax return is a lot simpler and a lot shorter than the US.
It's doable. It's
but
doable.
It's the interplay between the two. And the US one is a nightmare anyway. But the interplay is the thing. So I think one of the rookie mistakes I made was thinking that I could do it because things would stay constant. And they don't.
No.
So in the early 80s, there was no such thing as the kind of remittance basis and the rising basis of tax from the UK point of view. You were just here. And then I suppose both countries can see easy pickings from their citizens abroad. There's a limit to how much you can do to wriggle out of stuff if you're going to be compliant. And so if I'm an American living in the UK and the system changes and they're now saying, well, now there's the remittance and a rising basis, and we're going to either charge you a fee if you don't want to, report everything, etc. And you can go into detail of that. What am I going to do? But equally, from the US point of view, US people get taxed because the dollar value of their mortgage changes, even though materially hasn't changed them at all, because it gets lumped in with all sorts of other foreign assets. And you end up paying real dollars for something that materially has not happened to you. From the US point of view, it's like, oh, well, you got caught up in the net.
Yeah.
Or you run a business in the UK as an American person, and you've got to report all the changes that happened after 2018 for look-through payment, which literally is the acronym GILTY,
Yeah.
GILTY. Who is now taking the mick? It's complicated. So one rookie mistake I feel I made was thinking that I had it cracked and that things weren't going to change. And over the years, I realized that's just a problem. And like most people, you only realize it's a problem when you get stung really badly, like when there's a fine for something, or you end up spending money on something that you needn't. Like when you were little, I thought, well, here's a great way to reduce capital gains tax in gifting you appreciated shares. And I did it completely the wrong way around, because you ended up paying and I end up paying capital gains twice.
Yeah.
Whereas if it was a UK person, there might be a way where you can end up not paying tax in either country for some certain scheme.
Yeah.
But I thought I was being clever, and it was actually ended up costing us money. So I think a big thing about the US UK tax system is it's complicated and it does keep changing.
Do you want to do my job for me? Because this sounds an awful lot like the apple not falling far from the tree.
But the other thing that I think was true is then after these kind of stingers happened, I think I learned that you need to get an accountant that's US, UK familiar. And that means you end up going to kind of the top of the tree, because there aren't so many. You could end up using two different accountants, probably end up costing you as much anyway. But the problem is they don't coordinate. So you need an accountant that can do both. And because they can do both, that's an extra speciality. Not every company can do it, so they can charge more. But actually, most of the time, you might think, oh, God, this is a lot of money. But every once in a while, every few years, you think, boy, that just saved me. Like when your grandma, when my mother passed away, she had a living trust. It got complicated. I got an inherited IRA. And that was definitely, like I'm saying about things don't stay the same. It's not just that the tax code doesn't stay the same, but the family situation doesn't stay the same. And so I ended up inheriting some stuff that got taxed as income rather than capital gains. It just is messy. It's a bit like insurance. You begrudge paying insurance, but the best things that could ever happen is you pay the insurance premium and you never have to claim, because that means something bad happened.
What I'm sure that those accountancy colleagues I've had who've been on this podcast and also would be listening will be delighted to hear you talking about what wonderful value they are, rather than talking about what a pain in the backside it is dealing with them.
But I think the pain in the backside is actually just dealing with
it's not their fault. Yeah, it's not their fault.
The American tax code is phenomenally difficult. And I would say, I wonder whether there's a vested interest in keeping it complicated, because it keeps a lot of people in business. But it is so complicated that you have to gather all this information. And it's the gathering of the information. And you're going to have to do that whether you give it to an accountant or whether you do it yourself. That's the thing that's difficult.
You were very, very good in your explanation, and I should definitely give you a job doing my sort of promoting my work for me yourself. I wouldn't be your son if I didn't point out one thing, that the acronym GILTY actually ends in an I, not a Y. But other than that, it's the Global International No Tax Initiative or Income or whatever, but it ends in an I. Otherwise, 10 out of 10 for your explanation.
Yeah. And the only other thing I'd say is, if you're a tax complication, is don't marry a Brit. Then that wouldn't be as complicated, because there's the whole what you do with your assets and your partner. Quite rightly, both countries, US and the UK, you can pass your assets to your same nationality spouse. But if the spouse is a different nationality, of course, that spouse could then leave the country and they wouldn't get to tax it on the second death.
Correct.
So it does make sense that they make restrictions, but it does make things more complicated if you're married to someone from another country.
We don't give people that lovely, generous $13 million, $14 million estate tax allowance like the Americans currently do. So,
But you do allow stuff to be given away with up to 7 years. And then it's like, in a way, in a sense, it could be unlimited, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
things never staying constant. I was in a university alumni thing, and one of my US alumni friends went white as a sheet when she heard someone say that there was now capital gains tax to pay on your primary residence, on your main home. Because when she'd moved to the UK and she wasn't planning on staying for a very long time, she stayed here a really long time. And when she'd left the United States, there was no tax on your main home. The laws had changed and she hadn't realized. And she went white as a sheet because she said she'd lived in London in a house, not a flat, a house in London for 40 years. And that capital gain was going to be her children's inheritance.
Yeah.
And it really shocked her. So there are big planning things that I think need to be taken into account when you're living in a country different from the one that you grew up in. But equally, I've also been an expat in the United States. I was a US citizen employed locally by a London company who then got sent abroad to the US. And that just about did my head in from a tax point of view.
It wasn't all bad, your trip to the US. I think your favorite child was born in the US. So, mitigating it, the silver linings.
The birthing experiences were very different, I have to say.
I don't know how much I want you to go into the birthing experiences on my podcast.
The NHS is absolutely amazing. Yeah. And I think it's fabulous, especially when there are life events or, big things happen. The day-to-day is enough to make you pull your hair out. And there is a rationing of services. But if you've got medical insurance in the United States, you're fine. And the whole hospital experience is quite a luxurious.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I should implore you more to bang the drum for why Americans need to take advice. I promise you, I have not prepped my mother to say any of that. It's just how she truly feels. I guess a place to be really useful to finish on is there anything else that you can think of that you think either offers solidarity or anything you've learned over the last X number of years living in the UK as an American that you think might be of use to those listening who maybe haven't been here quite so long, even if only as trite as make sure to look the other way when you're crossing the street, because don't forget, we drive on the other side of the road.
I would say one thing is from a tax and estate planning and investing point of view, it's complicated, but it's not always as complicated as people can sometimes worry that it is. I mean, you can be an investor in both countries. You just have to take a real interest in it and make sure that you keep abreast of what's going on. But if you're the type of person who it's not your first priority, it's a bad idea to do all the accounts yourself or all the investing. I mean, I invest myself. I've learned to navigate where the pitfalls are. And I guess my tip would be that it's often the case that people end up staying in another country longer than they thought they were going to. So planning ahead is probably no bad thing.
Completely agree with you about the taking of care around investments. As with the shout out to our accountancy colleagues earlier on, there is also, of course, for those who have investments or want to invest but don't have the time or the expertise to do so themselves. I've had enough of my lovely colleagues on to talk about investment management from a US-UK perspective, and there are people there who can help and indeed who would be delighted to talk to you if you're someone who finds yourself in this position. So as with the accounting, if you think you can do it yourself, be absolutely sure you can do it yourself. And if you're not sure, reach out, because I've said this many times before on this podcast and otherwise, I tend to find that this community in London and in the wider UK is a very friendly, nice, cooperative, collaborative community. We all get along very well, largely bred out of the fact that most Americans are nice people, and so they're a pleasure to work with, despite the fact I grumble sometimes. And so it's always better to reach out and ask, and we'll tell you if we don't need to help you. Better that than the other way around. I really appreciate you coming on, Mum. I'm conscious of taking up too much of your time. You're probably desperate to get back to your Christmas lunch that you're probably having as we speak. And I really appreciate you coming on to do the Christmas special. If only every episode was as fun and enlightening as talking to your mother.
Thank you. And Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone listening.
You say Happy Christmas here, don't you?
We say Happy Christmas, yes. Happy holidays. For those listening, thank you so much for listening. Do leave a review or any comments wherever you are listening to this. And do join us again as part of our regularly scheduled broadcast when we'll be back to much more serious and important topics. But for the meantime, a Merry Christmas from me and from everyone at Collie Bristow, and a Happy New Year to you and your family. And we will see you in the new year. Thank you very much.